From the Sky News Centre, this is Paul Murray Live.
Thank you, Sherry. Now, as we know, all of last year was $450 million worth of distraction. What could have been achieved as a 60-40 yes win was, of course, dragged out for an entire year and became 60-40 no, because the Prime Minister knew that this would be an issue that could seal his place in the history books regardless of how long his Prime Ministership went. He would be the one who brought a voice to Parliament. That's why it went on for as long as it went on. We were critical of that at the time. The reality, of course, was that as we were focused on cost of living, they were focused on changing the Constitution. Now, today, we started to learn about just how much money was flowing in and around the two campaigns. Now, of course, the yes ads, very well produced, had the extreme amount of money, whereas the no campaign was as close to you can get an actual grassroots effort of people pushing back. Now, yes, there were millions of dollars that they had, but it's nowhere near the $75 million that was handed over as donations to people supporting the Yes campaign. Well, today was the day that the Australian Electoral Commission actually told us who gave what to whom. Now, it's not that hard to actually go and find where the majority of the money went. Because, as I say, $75 million is what made its way towards the Yes campaign, at least what's been declared via the Electoral Commission. And as even the Turnbull Times has noticed here, that it was 5 times as much as was being spent on the other side. Now, remember, it was tax deductible. On the yes side, it had to be fought for it to be tax deductible on the no side. So we know where the establishment wanted Australians to go. Well, again, today, the $75 million, where did it come from? Well, from massive companies, from huge corporations, from Indigenous land councils, from political parties, from independents, Bunnings and BHP and the Commonwealth Bank, Telstra, just some of the big corporates who decided to pick that side that, of course, was not where the majority of Australian people were by a margin of. Every single state and the Northern Territory, 60-40. Now, you may remember that there were plenty of people who tried to pretend that there was not a money disadvantage to the No campaign. Instead, they kind of kept it quiet about what all of the obvious money was, and they tried to make it seem like the No campaign had more money and they were spending it in particularly nefarious ways. Of course, the reality was quite the opposite. It was all publicly available where the ads were going, and obviously they were being paid for. Today we learn 5-1. $75 million to the Yes campaign, 5 times less to the No campaign. And there is one word that was used over and over again to dispel anyone who had a problem or even a question with a planned change to our Constitution.
Misinformation.
Misinformation.
The misinformation.
Up outrage, trying to start a culture war.
It is importing Trump-style politics.
Misinformation.
Misinformation.
Now, were things said by both sides that may not well be able to pass the pub test? You betcha. But the reality was that anything that was against what was being suggested by the people who were pushing it and who were behind it was somehow misinformation was their catch cry of just trying to dismiss any and everyone who had a problem with the change that was being proposed, the one that was already costing $450 million of taxpayers' money. Throw on top of that the extra $75 million, and we now have well over $500 million worth of money that was going into the yes side of the equation. Now, the government will say the 450 was, of course, just the administration and absolutely down the middle, despite the fact that, of course, the Yes campaign tried to, at one point in time, actually appropriate the colours of the Australian Election Commission, the Australian Electoral Commission. But that word misinformation, which was in that case was used very specifically to make it seem like Australians at the start of the process, they completely agree, but all the lies and the BS meant that eventually they ended up disagreeing. So that keyword misinformation is one that is often used by the powerful and often on the left to be able to disqualify the people who simply disagree with them.
Misinformation.
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 The misinformation which is there.
Some misinformation.
And this government is now trying to pass a law that will censor the internet, principally, it will go after social media companies who continue to post what the government defines as being misinformation. Now, the person who will be responsible for the introduction of this law is the Communications Minister, Michelle Rowland. Now, Michelle Rowland has the powers under this piece of legislation to, if she wants to, tell the Australian Communications and Media Authority to investigate a claim of misinformation that is swirling around on social media. Now, let me be clear here that we are not talking about anything that breaches defamation laws. We're not talking about anything that breaches vilification laws. We're not talking about discrimination laws. We're talking about a brand new law that will decide whether or not what you read on social media is the government-approved story versus the narrative that they are trying to push. And it is self-evident, as we know over recent years, that we've been told that something's a conspiracy theory and then it ends up coming true. And it's not just to do with, of course, the world of COVID and the over-response to it. But again, it's a reminder about one of the biggest battles that the common sense part of this country, from the far left to the far right, should all be unifying around, which is the idea of a government instrumentality being able to decide what you can and can't read in the political discourse. But let me, again, further explain what the plans are under this legislation. Legislation that, by the way, everything from media companies to the Human Rights Commission say will have an effect on free speech. Now, if a Karen decides that something that is posted on social media that comes from, say, this program is something that they don't like, despite the fact that we try to show you the data behind the opinion, therefore citing our sources, as the teachers would tell you in primary school, show your working. Well, of course, they would simply complain because they don't like the message. Now, they can complain if they want to somebody in the media who will eventually raise the ire for the minister, and the minister can then tell the Australian Communications and Media Authority, or the Karen can go directly to the Australian Communications and Media Authority, the same people who regulate television and radio in this country, but now they want to be giving them powers to regulate the internet. Now, when the internet started and it was the Wild West, the concept of anyone censoring the internet would be such a radioactive idea. But 30 years later, that's exactly what is currently planned to be done under the plan to stop misinformation. Now, of course, the way that it works is that we've had a self-regulation to this point in time, but the expectation here is that bureaucrats, as part of the Australian Communications and Media Authority, well, they would decide whether the post that you have shared on social media breaches the law or not, and while they won't fine you and they won't fine the person who originally wrote the article or made the video, they will fine the social media companies. And of course, the social media companies, faced with the threat of a fine, whether it's true or not true, whether it's feeding him information, unpopular information, or information that simply the government doesn't like, of course, it'll be the too hard basket. This stuff will automatically start to be deleted from the internet. But another thing that the Australian Communications and Media Authority and the government is going to further empower is the role of the fact checker. Now, of course, the fact checker over there at the ABC for some period of time has been one that is connected with the RMIT. Now, they have now broken up with that organisation, but this is the organisation that claims on the ABC's website tonight that only 3 promises have been broken by this government. Just 3. Now, anyone who's actually paying attention, and again, we've shown you the receipts, how often, every night, there's way more than 3. But no, the official fact checkers, well, they say that's only 3. So therefore, that would be used as information for the Australian Communications and Media Authority to say, well, no, this independent umpire has turned around and has ruled your fact to not be a real fact. It's the fact that they decide to put the tick of approval on, and that's the way that it goes. But while people were, understandably, lost in the Easter holidays, including the extra day off on the Monday or even Tuesday. I think there's actually officially an Easter Tuesday public holiday today in Tasmania. G'day to everyone who's watching us there. Well, the Institute of Public Affairs, they put out an announcement which was some of their research, where they actually had a look at some of these fact checkers and which side they end up falling on the side of. One of them had a chat to Chris Kenny last night, and it's pretty obvious that the fact checkers lean left.
They're all pretty bad, but the RMIT Fact Lab based on our research, is by far the most biased. In the case of COVID-19 and climate change, they have not fact-checked a single advocate of those policies. 100% of the time, they focus critics. That's a sort of North Korean level of consensus over at RMIT.
Now, we saw that during the COVID pandemic, there were literally thousands of social media posts that were complained about by the federal government to the social media companies with a direction, please get rid of them. Now, these weren't about whether this treatment was fair or not, or what the potential side effects or dangers may be of medical treatments. No, no, no. These were including memes about politicians. Now, if you have essentially a feedback loop of academia, which already leans left, quoting itself, because they often run the fact-checking organisations, well, of course, many of the things that were conspiracy theories a couple of years ago, which were provably not conspiracy theories back then, they were just unpopular opinions, but they were given by academics. You then have fact-checking organisations saying this academic is okay, this academic isn't okay, even though they both have exactly the same qualifications. Now, this piece of legislation, as I say, should affect anyone from the far left who would be afraid that a right-wing government would rule their facts to be no facts whatsoever, and this government ruling anything that they don't like from the centre-right and outwards, again, to be narratives that are not acceptable. Things like reasons why or potential consequences of a change to a constitution, which Australians rejected last year. Misinformation, Trumpian politics. Watch this one, because there's an awful lot of people that are stacking up against it. Now, I don't want to settle for a law that simply turns around and starts to punish individuals for what they post on the internet. Because what I think the actual purpose of this legislation is to stop the dissemination of information that comes from the media sources that the government of the day. Now, remember, this might be the government you like, unlikely if you're watching this program, but if it ends up being a government you don't like, they have the full power to be able to slowly but surely whack-a-mole, not on lies, not on things that are defamatory. There are already a whole series of processes that are able to stop that information flowing around. It's just the narrative they don't like. So imagine what Chris Bowen and Albo may well do with the power to shut down any conversation about what was really going on with those two planes. Of course, it's all just about what the Air Force says, right? And of course, those two planes, which were on the airstrip in the Hunter Valley late last week, so the Prime Minister could go and hand out the start of $1 billion to a collection of companies to help supercharge what they believe to be the technology that will help cut 43% of 1% of global emissions, that being Australia. But as I said, the plane thing somewhat has overshadowed some of the other deeper questions that we still should be talking about today about how this money is going to be handed out. The sort of crony capitalism that means that taxpayers' money goes to companies that are owned by some of the richest citizens in our country. Mike Cannon-Brookes, of course, has a significant stake in a company called SunDrive. This is a company that has got taxpayer money to help supercharge its production of solar panels in Australia, so we buy fewer slave labour ones from China. But of course, the slave labour ones from China will always be cheaper, which means if you go off price, whether Australians will buy the Australian-made or not, pretty obvious which way they'll go. But remember, this is a company that should be able to, if it needs more money, just ask the dude in the hat who's already got billions of dollars. It shouldn't be you and I that are helping to add to this. This is the same company that the former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, has an interest in, and a former federal government minister and supporter of Turnbull in Wyatt Roy is a special advisor to. Now, again, there is nothing illegal or nefarious about what I'm saying here. It's just when you sit around and you're divvying up taxpayers' money, would you give it to a company that didn't have connections to billionaires and former prime ministers? Because they could be the source of the money that they are trying to get from the taxpayer. That would logically be the case, but instead, the people who could get it from the people who own the company instead end up getting it from the taxpayer. Now, SunDrive believes that they can build a better mousetrap when it comes to solar panels, and the government has given them the money to help them start to build them. But again, why did the government give them the money when they are owned by billionaires and multi-millionaires who could find the loose change in their car and be able to fund the work themselves. But again, the conversation understandably has been a distraction from that bigger, more complicated point, the more sort of ingrained point about what companies should and shouldn't be getting taxpayer funds because of the way in which the scheme was announced. Warren Brand did a great cartoon about this in the Telegraph today in Sydney, which of course was the Prime Minister and Bowen standing there saying that they were doing their best to fight the evils of climate change, while of course it was gas-guzzling planes, of which they had 2 of, and Comcars as well. And the Comcar part of this is something I'll get to in a second, because my mate Ray Hadley has made an excellent point about how the gas-guzzling wasn't just not 1 but 2 planes to carry the egos from Canberra, where they both were, 20 minutes apart, rather than all getting on 1 plane. And as Peter Credlin expertly pointed out today about how the excuse around the Air Force is all garbage, it is, of course, the decision of the government to request it, and they, because of how many people they wanted to take, on top of the number of ministers that they were taking, meant that they ended up with 2 planes because the bigger plane couldn't land at Scone Airport. Now, of course, it could land at Williamtown Air Base, and then they could get in a car and drive to the Liddell power plant. But that would have meant more time on the roads. And as the Prime Minister told us, when it came to refugees landing on the side of Western Australia, remember, he didn't know because he'd been in the car and therefore his phone doesn't work. So for national security, he needed to fly 2 planes to get a little bit closer, but then to get into the Comcars. Well, the Albanese government has made no apologies for putting climate change near the top of its agenda. No surprise here. But the editorial in the Courier Mail today says it well. So to have 2 gas-guzzling VIP jets going to the same place seems to be in direct conflict with that agenda. The extra cost to taxpayers is also a tough pill for many to swallow. Again, Peter's saying it's about $100,000, as energy and grocery bills were soaring for most households. It's about the idea of the government treating money with the urgency that you treat your own money. Instead, because it's other people's money, they just splash it around and think no one will notice. And how dare you ask the question? Misinformation. This episode could serve as a reminder to the Albanese government not to take anything for granted, especially taxpayers' money. Now, remember, we brought you last night how Casanova Bowen said that it really wasn't his fault. He couldn't really be blamed for anything because despite the fact that only 1 Prime Minister and maybe 1 minister, or in this case 2 ministers, so 3 people, could have all sat on 1 jet, but they all had staff and they all had security, which meant we needed 2 jets. And it's not our fault, it's what the Air Force told us, because the airport we're flying into to save us the car ride from the airport to where we're planning the media announcement, well, it's just closer, so why are you complaining?
The Prime Minister has a large jet available to him. That would normally be what we take. The runway at Scone wasn't strong enough to take the large jet, so the Air Force recommended and took the decision for 2 small jets.
It was impossible for you to go together in the one plane.
Even the small jets weren't fully laden because of the weight restrictions on the. Even if we had, with the Prime Minister's security detail and other people involved, going from, as you'd imagine, the Prime Ministerial visit, 2 cabinet ministers, we limited the number of staff, and even then, that was the Air Force advice, the most efficient way of getting us there.
Well, we took 2 planes, not 3. I mean, if we brought everyone, it would have been 3 planes. So what are you complaining about? Again, it's all about how they treat your money. And if they think that you won't notice or you won't care, or if you do care, you're kind of surplus to requirement. Because as I said, let's even take the entire transportation question out of it. I got plenty of questions about why companies that are owned by billionaires and former prime ministers don't go to the former prime ministers and billionaires for their extra funding. Instead, it's you and I that end up having to give that extra funding. I got plenty of questions about that. But you think there's brick walls in and around transport. There's even more brick walls when you start to ask that question. But I will continue to ask it. But again, there's a little detail here. They flew 2 planes to a smaller airport because it was closer to where they wanted to make the announcement. Well, how did they get from the airport to the place where they were making the announcement? They didn't walk. They weren't on unicycles. They weren't on a penny farthing. They weren't tag teaming and double teaming on a BMX. Of course, they were being driven in cars. They're not going in taxis. They're not getting their mate to pick them up. Instead, most likely, and certainly with the Prime Minister, they would be using Comcars, the limousine service that you and I pay for. But there are no Comcars that are based around the airport at Scone, which means they had to come from somewhere else. How many Comcars float around the Hunter Valley on any one day? I wouldn't think that many. So did somebody have to drive from Sydney all the way to the airport to take the Prime Minister from the airport to the announcement? And maybe they had to come from even further away. This too proves that the whole let's fight climate change by forcing cars to drive further than they would naturally be needed to get to an airport where more planes than were required were being used. Again, Ray Hadley asks the question and he quite correctly says, this will all come out, which means the story doesn't disappear just because Chris Bowen did a press conference on an Easter Monday. This keeps going and going and going. In fact, here's what Ray Hadley had to say about that today.
So they get to Scone. It's about a 50k trip down to Liddell via Muswellbrook, and we're trying to find out how they got from Scone to Liddell. Now, given there was a security contingent there, and given yesterday I said from my investigations I can't find a rental car company anywhere around Scone, so I can only imagine they either bust it down on the Scone Bus Company, which is highly unlikely given it's the Prime Minister, or Comcars were sent from somewhere else. Comcars possibly came from Newcastle, possibly a fleet came from Sydney, or, shock horror, maybe they even came from Canberra, who knows?
This will eventually come out. And when it comes out, their embarrassment, or, more importantly, their let-them-eat-cake attitude will become even more clear. Now, of course, the Prime Minister's people were behind the decision about how many planes were being taken. So when the Prime Minister appeared, once everyone went back to work, with the exception of Tasmania, on this Tuesday, he appeared in front of the media today. Now, we had a lot of different announcements, and yes, there was some big news around today around an Australian aid worker who'd died in Gaza. But guess how many questions the media bothered to ask the Prime Minister about the two jets and why they had to have two jets and where the cars came from and how much all of this cost and who truly approved of it? Who truly asked for it? Well, of course, there were no questions today. Now, I get it, the Prime Minister was talking about other things, but who cares? You're there to ask a question. No one in the Canberra Press Gallery or the people who were representing them today could be bothered to ask the Prime Minister about the two jets. And that in and of itself becomes part of the problem. That you have so many people who work in and around politics who just don't mention it when it's the politicians that they like. The ones that have brought them closer to the process than the politicians they don't like, who probably didn't invite them to the lodge for Christmas drinks. The people who don't communicate with them on the inside, who don't give the one-on-one interviews that this mob now give, let alone the philosophical reasons. But it's a legitimate story. It's a real story whether they want to admit it or not. Why don't they ask any questions about it? That in and of itself is perhaps one of the more interesting questions, and the answer perhaps a little more frightening. Now, of course, this Prime Minister and his Treasurer pretend that cost of living's at the absolute heart of everything and anything that they do. It's all about making sure that they can save people money, despite the fact that it's the same government that took $1,500 off 10 million workers, the same government that, of course, does not in any way, shape or form plan to cut petrol taxes. Instead, they increase them to the highest rate they have ever been. Well, I want to turn everyone's attention to the reality of cost of living. This from the Age newspaper, hardly far right wing. 54% of Victorians are experiencing cost of living and personal debt distress beyond normal levels, according to Suicide Prevention Australia. Yeah, another far right-wing think tank. The number of Victorians struggling with everyday expenses or to keep up with credit cards was up 7% in the past 12 months, up 16% compared to 18 months ago. Oh, but I thought the too little, too late tax cuts were going to fix everything. In comparison, 49% of people in New South Wales, 47% of Queenslanders also say that they are having troubles right now when it comes to financial issues. And another example about other people's money that I quickly want to mention to you here. Well, of course, one of the things that this Prime Minister promised that he would do, but of course broke the promise, does that count as one of the 3 broken promises, according to the fact checkers who will be used by the government and bureaucrats to decide what you can and can't read, share, watch on the internet? Well, the Prime Minister, of course, said no changes to superannuation.
There won't be major changes to super. There'll be no major changes to superannuation. There won't be major changes. There won't be major changes to superannuation. There won't be major changes.
Well, of course, there were changes, but because the word major, well, is it a broken... Yeah, it's a broken promise, right? Because it doesn't matter what job you actually do, we're all forced by the government to put a percentage of our wage towards our retirement. And people who end up with something more than $3 million, which is a very few amount of people, but still, more than $3 million for their retirement, well, they end up getting little tax whacks, which are going to take place in the next little while. But there is an interesting group of people who are lobbying the government to say, no, hands off our super. Please don't tax our more than $3 million we've got for our retirement. Judges and people in the legal fraternity are the latest to say that they should be exempt. If you make $3 million in the private sector, yeah, you should be taxed. If you worked so hard and you ended up working 80 hours a week, no, whatever, you don't matter. Judges. And according to the Financial Review today, several retired judges are demanding that Labor exempt lucrative judicial pensions from its plan to increase taxes on big superannuation accounts, saying their inclusion could be unconstitutional and treats them more harshly than other retirees. A group representing former judges separately warned that the government's tax could endanger the court's independence and drain talent from the bench. So you should pay the tax. The same way you should pay for the travel. The same way you should not spread misinformation. Remember, our job in their world is shut up and pay your taxes because it's your fair share. Lots of debate tonight we will get to in a moment, of course, with none other than Michael Kroger, Nicholas Rees and Nigel Farage. He joins us as well tonight. So we're just getting started. It'll be a good one. I hope you're in a good place because you're not going anywhere for the next half hour or so. Well, our two mates from Melbourne are particularly happy this evening, and it's not just because one of them's about to become the Lord Mayor, but it's because both of their footy teams got up on the weekend. My mighty West Tigers did as well, 1 point. And I tell you what, you'll have a 1 point thriller over a, 6-goal win, but still both of these blokes, well, of course, Tigers being my West Tigers, not Richmond Tigers, as of course the Bolt boys are into. But of course, Nicholas Rees, Carlton got up, and of course, with Michael Kroger, the D's got up. So we're all nice and happy. Were you there in the stands or watching it on Fox Footy?
We're happy. Fox Footy, of course.
Of course, good boy.
Yes, I couldn't get to the game, but by goodness, Carlton is having a flying start to the season. And the Blues are up and about.
All right, I apologise. I have hit mute on this computer about 16 times. So everyone's sending me messages. I appreciate it. That's what the little dings are, but they're also little dings to say. Just very quickly, I said it in an even more heartfelt fashion a couple of days ago, but Nicholas is about to become the Lord Mayor. He'll become that in June, and then there'll be an election in October. Congratulations, mate. It is all well and good to work your guts out for a cause or a party or somebody else that you've done as a staffer, but to have the balls to put your own name on the ballot paper and then to see that a good suburban kid like yourself ends up being the Lord Mayor of the second greatest city in the country. Well done, mate. Well done. The greatest is the Gold Coast, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. And it's fair to say you and I have had a lot of fun on this program over the years. Some almighty dust-ups, a lot of laughs, a lot of jousting, a lot of jokes. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, God love you. All right, let's get into something far less contentious, and that's the definition of hate speech in this country. Now, as we know, there are wants at the state level to try to go after laws, particularly for these nasty preachers which have been saying the mad things that they have in the past. But I offer just a small note of caution here, not because I want to give carte blanche to these people, but there are other versions of this legislation which have already been put into effect, like in Victoria, where it is an actual criminal offence to vilify, i.e. joke, about somebody's gender, sexuality. That is a jailable offence. Now, my belief is that just like good old-fashioned legal studies in Year 9, there's a difference between whether you did something or whether you meant to do something. So therefore, about whether you mean to vilify somebody or whether you are just joking, in my view, is an important thing to have a chat about here. But We know that this is a conversation that is happening in and around us. So, Michael, how do we make sure that we create laws that very obviously say that if a hate preacher is sitting up there on the Christian occasion of Good Friday, that of course is not recognised by his religion, saying the most awful things about Jews, that it's covered there, but we don't have a scenario where basically it becomes the beginnings of blasphemy laws because you go after somebody because of their religion?
So, mate, the answer is you have to work out in a Western democracy where the line is drawn between free speech and something which should be against the law. And the line needs to be drawn. On one side, you have to have the right to offend someone, to ridicule someone, to oppose someone, to abuse someone. That's got to be acceptable in a modern democracy. Once you cross the line towards inciting violence or inciting hatred, that's what we're talking about here is something which shouldn't be permitted under the law. So an Islamic preacher who says in a mosque, "Death to Jews," or "I see a Jew behind a tree," or people that yell, "Kill the Jews," if that's what they said, to me that's what they said, that crosses the line between acceptable and unacceptable speech. And the modern example of that is, as I've just mentioned, how these laws in New South Wales do not apply to these Islamic preachers is beyond me, and the extent that Min says he's going to strengthen the law, good. Incitement to violence should be illegal. Promoting violence should be illegal. But on the other hand, I haven't seen any rabbis in synagogues calling for death to Muslims in recent months. And so, Chris Minns, the eyes of the world are on you, my friend, because your state has become the hate capital of Australia, and you need to do something about it.
Because, Nicholas, my issue simply is that I agree with every word that Michael just said, and everyone who wants to do something particularly about the rise of anti-Semitism that happens right here. But when some of the legislation talks about saying things about people because of their faith, or ridiculing people because of their faith, or attacking people because of their faith, how do you not end up in a scenario where, and again, I'm not equating the same things to be true, but I'm saying this is what you have to be careful with the law, is that people dress up as nuns in the Mardi Gras each and every year. How is that not going to be deeply offensive to people of the Christian faith and Catholic faith in particular? So you've got to be very specific here with the laws, otherwise you're going to end up in a scenario where where they can be overly interpreted by judges and governments and causes a little further down the track.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we need to acknowledge that there is some complexity in these debates, and there has to be. As Michael said, on the one hand, we all accept that free speech is the bedrock of our democracy, and that means that you have to sometimes hear things you're not going to agree with and that will offend you. On the other hand, if those statements cross a line and go into inciting hatred or violence against other people in society, then in my view, I agree with Michael. I think you're crossing a line at that point. Now, I think context is also important when judging the consequence of these words. So, you said the word joke before. Now, look, the specific carve-out in many jurisdictions where these provisions already exist that allow someone who is making statements in the context of a comedy or a stand-up comic production to say things that you wouldn't necessarily be able to say in a different context. And it also goes to, the nun walking down Oxford Street in the Mardi Gras as well. Context is important there. Obviously, the person dressed up as the nun is not trying to incite hatred against a particular church. They're doing it in a comical way, and so therefore it's allowable. Now, I understand there's grey areas here, and it does get complex. In fact, it gets messy. But I think it's important that we do try to navigate our way through these things, because hate speech is on the rise in Australia, and we do need to see governments taking a tougher stance. So I think the Minns government should be doing more, and I think these proposals in New South Wales are a good thing.
Just one last one on this, though. We have different examples of this again. Where let's take race and get into the world of gender. I mean, literally in Scotland, it is a criminal offence to misgender somebody. Now, people like J.K. Rowling openly turned around and say, well, sorry, there's only two sexes, men and women, and you can't tell me that, you can switch between, so therefore I'll call you by the name that was on your birth certificate at the time you were born, not the one that you were able to fill out later. she's made that very clear, and a preponderance, if not a majority, of young people running around our universities right now think it should be a criminal offence to misgender somebody in Australia going forward. And again, Michael, this is just my issue, right, which is that we all think that we put these laws together to stop a series of behaviours that are targeted at the people that we like by the people who we don't like because of what they target to those people. But in a country that becomes less religious, other things start to replace as holy figures, such as race, sexuality, gender, and you get what's happening right now in Scotland. So it's not me arguing about slippery slope, it's just pointing out that, you know, these line in the sand, they change with the population.
Yeah. So one of the lessons out of the Voice, mate, is simply this. Governments ought to be aware of being intimidated by activists, the left-wing activists who are on the public payroll, students, etc., who've got plenty of time for activism, to go to demonstrations, to lobby governments. None of them are small business people or farmers, by the way. They're all the professional classes, the elites. Beware being intimidated and lobbied by these people. And this is obviously what's happened in Scotland. Of course, J.K. Rowling should be able to say, I believe there are two sexes. She's not inciting hatred. She's not inciting violence. She's expressing an opinion. An Islamic preacher, as I said, who gets up in a mosque and says death to Jews, basically, that crosses the line. That's hate speech. That's incitement to violence. That should be criminalised. But, you know, hurting someone's feelings cannot be a criminal offence. Otherwise, all free speech dies in Western democracies. And one of the great strengths of our democracies is diversity of opinion, which is what you don't see in China, you don't see in North Korea, you don't see in Russia, and you don't see in Iran, you don't see in Palestine, by the way, in the West Bank or in Gaza. You don't see free speech. So that's where I draw the line. And governments who act in an extreme manner, like the Scottish government, they're going to create just a world of litigation for years to come, and it'll be very damaging to the country.
And I would argue that that's what's happening with this federal government when it comes to the attempt to introduce fines and a regulatory system around misinformation, all right? Now, clearly, lies, outright defamation, outright discrimination, all of these things are covered, all right? But I'm talking about a narrative the government doesn't like. So if the official line out of the government, Nicholas, is, we needed to take 2 jets because the Air Force said we had to take 2 jets, and anyone turning around saying, well, hang on, that shouldn't be taking place, well, that may well be if a Karen wants to go off and complain, and a whole bunch of people that are sympathetic to their employers, part of the system, they'll turn around, rule it to be misinformation, and that's a slippery slope that this government wants to send us on now. They're currently lubing up the slide.
Well, look, again, I agree it's complex. There is a slippery slope there. 5 years ago, I probably would have agreed with you on this, Paul. But now through modern media and social media and digital platforms, you know, there are these parallel universes that exist where blatant misinformation is being used to divide society, cause great social harm. And we need to have some sort of response to that, and I agree it's not easy to make these laws, but I think we need to have a go at it. As for J.K. Rowling, look, I think she's a brilliant author. I've read all of her books, so have my kids. Much joy to be found there, but I don't think she's a great legal mind, and I don't think she really understands these hate laws in Scotland. Again, context is important. If you say these things, it has to be with the intention of being abusive and spreading hate, and clearly you know, someone having a lark or using, you know, saying something not particularly nice in the context of a comedic performance is not going to bring you into breach of these laws. Now, she's a gender-critical feminist.
Your joke is vilification. That's the point of the laws running out of control. And that's where I think we're beginning to head. And we know that what is reasonable offence and a common standard of offence has now completely changed to what the activists seek to define as a certain form of offence, which is emblematic by the person who seeks to say they are offended as if it was a decree on their life or their safety, because there's a joke or even a comment about whether there are 2 genders. Now, I want to talk about voice funding, all the rest of it. Let's take a quick and early break now, because I don't want to rush this one. In fact, actually, sorry, I've got Nigel Farage next, so I've got to get this done now. So let's talk about the voice funding. 5-1 margin that they ended up having. But Nicholas, a lot of people and a lot of companies that shouldn't have jumped in but did, and they ended up backing what 60% of the country and every state, including woke Victoria, said hell no to.
Look, I think it was perfectly legitimate for companies to support the yes case, equally legitimate for companies to support the no case. I know the simple story you can tell here is that companies should just, stick to their lane and return shareholder value, full stop. The complex truth is that companies have a responsibility to go beyond their shareholders. They've got to be mindful of their employees. They've got to be mindful of their customers. They've got to be mindful of the culture in their organisation and the broader social culture and how they're contributing to that. And so I do agree that companies should be able to take a position on these things as long as they do it in a transparent way through, being open about it, reporting it and going through proper mechanisms within their organisation.
60% of them disagreed with the decision that they made, Michael.
Oh, look, these companies should stay out of this. They've done so much damage to themselves, Woolworths, Qantas, etc. They've done enormous damage to their brands by getting involved in this. The public were repulsed by what happened, and eventually what you saw was effectively with 60 million and 20-odd million, 80, what's that? $530 million was spent on The Voice, Albo. $530 million you caused to be sent on this because you couldn't stand up to the activists, the hardline activists on your own side. $500 million has gone down the drain. We get nothing to show for us except division. And just imagine, mate, what that money could have done in Alice Springs, Albo, what it could have done. But to your point, Paul, these corporates have had it's been disastrous for their brands, and they should know in future, don't be intimidated by the woke corporate affairs departments who send these recommendations to the board and the board members tick off on them. The board members should stand up and say no to this in future.
Love you, boys. Thanks for the deep dive into free speech and, expressing it as easily as you do on this program. Thank you, lads. Love you, Nicholas. Love you, Michael.
Cheers,
all right,
mate.
Quick break. Back with more. We're going to have a chat to Nigel Farage next. How did he shove it up the lefties with Easter eggs? We'll find out next. All together. Nigel Farage, as always, joins us on Tuesday night from London. The only way you'll see him on Aussie TV is on this show at this time. And great man, happy Easter, a couple of days after. But how did you give it to the lefties in a chocolatey fashion?
Oh, we had some dreadful health boss say, did you realise that the average Easter egg contains 3/4 of the calories of an adult's normal daily intake? Please make sure that you and your children don't eat a whole Easter egg at once. I mean, come on. For kids, there are 3 big events of the year. Your birthday, Christmas Day, and the Easter egg hunt on Sunday, and then stuffing yourself with loads of chocolate and spoiling Easter Sunday lunch. Now, I'm 60 tomorrow, but I have to tell you, I haven't grown out of that phase yet. I don't eat chocolate every day. I don't need some killjoy ruining Easter. So I ate a whole egg and put it up on Twitter and YouTube and TikTok and everywhere else. And actually, do you know what? I felt pretty good about it.
Yeah, of course. You were more than happy, more than happy. All right, let's talk now about the number of people which have been flowing into the country illegally, the migration issues as well on top of all of that. What's the latest in the UK?
Well, they still come. Another 800 young men without identification, without passports, without mobile phones arrived in the country on Saturday and Sunday. That continues. Legal migration is now running at 750,000 a year.
Wow.
These are numbers the likes of which we've never, ever seen. The country is, many parts of it are becoming literally unrecognisable from what they were 10, 20 years ago. And now we get some lefty think tank suggesting that maybe the Labour Party will give them all the vote. And that would be gerrymandering on the most humongous scale. I don't think the Labour Party would be stupid enough to do it because in the short term it would damage them just way too much. But, like Australia, America, and to some extent our country, managed migration and the building of an integrated society where we share things in common, like a language, like an education, like a loyalty, a sense of history, all of that can work. But when you subsume the population with vast numbers of people from different cultures, don't be surprised that they all stick together and actually, far from integrating, develop utterly separate communities. And that's what's going on, and it's a disaster.
And what I love here, right, is if you make any suggestions about illegal immigration and the eventual transfer of the illegal immigration to becoming full citizens with a potential political equation to it, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. That's the great replacement theory. You're being racist. This is a Labor Party think tank. So funnily enough, they think there might be a little bit of an up for Team Red if 5 million people got the chance to vote.
Yeah, it's exactly what they think, and it just shows you they know these people don't even believe in our country. They're ashamed of our flag, ashamed of our nation, desperate to change it in any way they can, without any thoughts of what the consequences may be. And don't forget, just a few weeks ago, we had a by-election to the British Parliament in Rochdale, won by an outright, openly Islamist candidate. You know, these are the consequences. Hundreds of thousands again marching in London on Saturday, some actually carrying swastikas on banners and barely reprimanded by the police. You know, that's what you get if you do this irresponsibly.
Yeah, it's crazy. It really is. Now let's talk about your mates of the Reform Party. As the weeks roll on, as we get closer to the general election, as the polls get worse for the Tories, that smile of yours, it gets wider, and I love that smile of yours.
Well, yeah, Reform is making amazing progress. A big poll out from YouGov on Friday, putting the party on 16%, with the Tories only 4 points in front. We could be on the edge of a complete implosion for a party that's been around for 190 years. And if that happens, Reform will be a very big beneficiary of it. The difficulty, of course, is we have an absolute first-past-the-post electoral system. So it is possible to get millions of votes and no representation. But maybe, just maybe, Reform is moving beyond that.
My oath. Looking forward to it. Thank you, mate. We'll, of course, follow with interest in the lead up to the election in the United Kingdom. Thank you very much. Now, also, just before I jump into a break here, I want to give a big shout out to my little girl Ash's teacher. In fact, Zadie's teacher as well. Parent-teacher day today. Both going very, very well. But I've got to say, while we talk a lot about education on this program, and rightly so, they were two examples of people who I know are all in on making sure that my little girls and everyone else around them in their classes has a wonderful education and a wonderful future. So to those teachers and their husbands, thank you. Quick break, back with more. Now, before we're totally done with Easter this year, can we talk about Joe Biden and Easter? Because this has always been a little bit weird. I don't know why I'm doing Trump hands right now, but I'm doing Trump hands. Because when I'm talking and I'm being critical, I will continue to be critical of Biden, okay? Remember a couple of years ago, and it was the Easter Bunny who had to prop him up while they were walking around as part of the traditional Easter egg roll and all the rest of it. That's not the Easter Bunny, by the way. That's Al Roker, who was doing the interview. But you get it. The Easter Bunny was literally propping up. It was incredibly embarrassing from a couple of years ago. Well, today, before the Easter egg roll officially took place amongst those that are chosen, there was this weird moment where Al Roker, who's the weatherman on the US Today show, asked the president about Easter, and then he said something that I'm not sure any other family in the world does.
How was Easter for you guys?
Great. We spent it up in Camp David. As a whole family, my dad used to say families are beginning, middle, and end. We had them all up there. We went to Mass on Saturday, and we had a great Easter egg hunt. We actually take these plastic eggs and put some dollars in them.
Oh, nice.
What tradition is this? Now, forgive me if this is a long-held tradition that I'm only just learning about now. You know, the recognition of the boulder being moved by Jesus is to put money in a plastic egg and then hand it out to people. I'm just assuming that money is so ingrained in the Biden family and he's so committed to the big guy that even the kids have to give 10% back to grandpa. Here's the late debate.